welcome to the Zoom Room sessions as part of our Thriving Tribe project. I'm David Francis Moore.
I'm Juliette Harvey.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. He is the Artistic Director of the Project Art Centre. It's Mr. Cian O'Brien. Welcome to the Zoom Room sessions, Cian.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
How would I describe myself? I think I would describe myself as a producer. I suppose that's the word I would use. I don't think that means that I'm not creative, but I'm definitely not an artist. I don't feel I can claim that title, but I think the word that describes what I do is making things happen is producer. What drew me to the arts, I suppose it was always an interest. I mean, it wasn't something that was always part of my experience as growing up and, and through my formative years. But I think when I was studying in college, I only then really realized that there was this opportunity that you could actually, live a life in the arts, and you could, have a job and do things. And again, it was never an interest of mine. That never had a kind of interest in being an artist, but certainly I liked the idea of making things happen. I think that's the interest for me. And the art form I was most naturally drawn to is theatre, or performance, I should say. So not just theatre, but also dance and live art. And I think that's where my interest was always held. So it was through those formative years that I think that the interest developed, but then the wanting, I suppose, the experience of it grew when I was studying and then, professionally. So before I was at the project, I worked for Rough Magic Theatre Company in Dublin. And so while I was there, obviously I was working a lot in project, because they make or made a lot of work at project. And that was the real experiencing the venue side of it as a whole, it's a whole, as it's a whole other thing. And so I think I was interested in finding out what that experience was like to actually put together then a program and then make that program happen, or how you build those relationships long term or short term with artists. Where but that's the journey. I have a name. I have to say, I didn't really have this this is my journey that I'm going to go on. It all felt a bit accidental. I think that's one of the great challenges, I think, of working in the arts sector, and one of the brilliant benefits of it is that there isn't a journey. It's very hard to have very few people have this career path where you go in that kind of traditional sense from higher profile job to higher profile job to whatever, a coffin. But I think that then at the same time, that doesn't mean you can't be ambitious, I suppose, for yourself and the kind of things that you might like to do. But I definitely, starting out, did not have any kind of plan. I had no idea what would happen. I was very lucky just to be able to go, I'm going to try this for a while and see where it goes. And, there's a great privilege to that. And so it was, I tried lots of things. I tried loads of different, I tried working freelance, working in, I had loads of math jobs. And I think that experience gives you kind of, I suppose, let's say short-term ambitions. I loved project, and I really wanted to work a project. How can I work a project? I worked in the bar and project for 2 years, from 2005 to 2007. So there was and in the marketing department, and, those kinds of, those experiences, built this, I really wanted, but now I'm like, well, what do I do now? I don't know, so that's a whole other, if you want another challenge in your life, I don't know what that is yet, But so it does feel accidental, and I think other people maybe have a much more clear sense. But I think when in a sector where everything is so insecure, and I realize it's easy for me to say that as a person who's, you know, paid a wage every month, but, you know, in a sector where everything is insecure, so insecure that actually I think having some kind of long-term plan can be kind of difficult, because there aren't that many options. If you're going to stay in Ireland and live and work in Ireland, I think there's very few options for you, you know, in a careerist sense. Every single one of those, in a way, there's elements of all of them in the approach you have to. Certainly, let's say my current experience in managing a house, running a house, programming, you know, working with the team, you know, and essentially, you know, running a business, albeit a not-for-profit one. But you know, I think all of those competencies speak to the kind of range of experience that you develop running an arts organization. So I think that's, you know, which is it's interesting to hear them listed out because they all resonate really, really clearly. I think one of the big challenges for an arts organization is how you balance all of those, because, you know, I mean, the one big challenge that every organization that's working in the arts faces is under-resourcing. And so how are you able to maximize the positives, the opportunities, the initiatives the ideas you might have, the people that you might work with? How do you maximize the potential of all of those alongside a kind of, you know, smart running of an organization, so that you don't, you know, run it into the ground or whatever. And I think so I think there's the one that really resonates, that I think that is coming to my head now, is the one learning by experience. And I think that's a big thing that everybody who works in the arts has to deal with, because there isn't you can't just learn how to be an arts manager. You know, you can do a postgraduate in arts management, but that doesn't actually teach you how to be an arts manager. That teaches you the kind of underlying core principles of the world that you might enter. And until you do it, you don't really know what it's like. And I mean, that's probably the same for a surgeon, right? I mean, you can learn about surgery in theory, but until you actually, you know, operate on somebody, you don't know what it's like, and you get better at it the more you do it, in theory. So, you know, I think for certainly, I think that's a big part of the work we do. And I think that you have to have a lot of trust in people, because people, you know, I think one of the glorious things about working in the arts also is that you get to do loads of mad things that other people never get the opportunities to do, because they don't work in the arts, because they, you know, they do something else. And I think that there's a great benefit to that, but it means that you're often doing things that you've never ever done before at very high stakes, you know, and you have to learn on the go. You know, I think that's a really it's a great skill that people have who are really successful in the arts. And I suppose the other thing that I think is a big challenge for us is how you transfer those skills. If you decide you want to, what's the word people use now, pivot. If you decide you want to pivot your career, how you do, you know, I think translating the skills beyond the arts is often a real challenge for people who work in the sector, because there is this perceived gulf that exists between the art sector and other sectors. And so I think that's something I think we have to get better at figuring out, how to articulate the high level of skill that exists amongst people who work in the sector, because it's vocational. I think that's a big one that I think isn't necessarily in there, is that idea that it is, you know, for a lot of people, you're making a commitment because you're committing to work in a sector that's badly paid, badly resourced, you know, it's really long hours. There's lots of negatives to it, but there are also loads of positives. So yeah, but I do think that's a really good list of, you know, real real things that people deal with on a day-to-day basis in working in the arts. I think it does. I think it's about opportunities. I think it's about being able to, that one of those there in the list was this idea about seeing opportunities. And they're not necessarily always, I think there's a difference between, I could suggest that there is financial entrepreneurship, but there's also other types of entrepreneurship that could exist within, the cultural sector, which are, I suppose, let's say artistic entrepreneurship, or, that they're not necessarily about money. You might need resources to achieve what the opportunity is, but that, being able to kind of take advantage of opportunities that might arise or appear, because somebody has this great idea, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, you're, in the middle of making some really exciting art project or community project, or, you're touring something to Macedonia, who knows? But like, I think there's a lightness of foot or touch or something that's needed in the arts to be able to respond to opportunities as they arise. But you can plan for things, and you can be, you can make big projects happen. But also, I think that that idea of being able to respond to things quickly, I think is the real sign of entrepreneurship in the arts. Being able to hear ideas, recognize good ideas, and then have the wherewithal to not let them slip through your fingers. I think one of the things that's really important, I think, is being able to work with lots of different people. I think that's a real, being a kind of a natural collaborator, or, and also being, diplomatic, maybe that's the right word to use, like a sense of diplomacy and how to negotiate complex situations, whether that's with a funder or with a artist or an audience member or whatever. That, I think those it's an ability to communicate well. It doesn't mean you're good at communication. It just means that you have an ability to communicate well. And I think that's something that's really important to me, certainly. But I suppose it is that it's also the idea that you can spot, well, in my job now, it's about kind of recognizing talent where, lots of people see it, but also sometimes there's a potential that you might see with a project or an artist or something that you read that sort of brings about an idea. And I think having that sense of openness to new ideas or new ways of working is important. I think one of the great challenges of working in a venue is not getting stuck in a rut. I think that's really hard. I think because it's so cyclical, the nature of the work in an art centre, especially one that isn't producing its own work most of the time. In project, we produce our gallery program ourselves, but most of the work that happens in performance spaces isn't produced by us. It's other people. So often it can feel like, the work might be really exciting, but in a sense, you're kind of, it's 48 weeks of program that you're slotting together. So there's a lot of traffic management as well, and relationship management. So I think that sense of being open to things is really important, so that you don't lose that sense of excitement about what you're doing or what you're programming, because otherwise it would just become, you might as well be, an air traffic controller or a logistics person in a transport firm. Do you know what I mean? I think that's so yeah, they're the things I think. But I mean, openness and diplomacy. Yeah. I think the advantage of that course was that I didn't study an arts degree. Well, I did, but I did geography. And so I think one of the reasons for me for wanting to apply for the course and then doing it was that it would give me a sense of, I suppose, knowledge about a sector that I felt like I hadn't spent 4 years doing a drama degree or the history of art degree or something. So I wasn't, I felt I didn't have that expertise. And actually, I think one of the things I took from that course was that I really am interested in policy. I think that's really, it's interesting. I'm interested in how it's formed. I'm interested in how decisions are made, and because that's how everything works. The reason why, you could argue, the reason why the cultural sector is in such difficult places because it has had policies put upon it as opposed to it leading on policies itself, and people making decisions about it who in some cases they know exactly what they're talking about, in other cases they don't. But I think there is a gap, right? I mean, it's not, you can't just, I didn't walk out of UCD with a job. It took time, but I think what it helped you develop was a network, which I think is important. It is important to have, to know, it's not who that's not what I mean, but it's at least having colleagues who you can call on for advice. And I got my first job, which was with a company called Classic Stage Ireland, which was based in the Helix in DCU, and it was run by a director called Andy Hines, and he had hired somebody from my master's, and then she got another job, and so she put me into, it was all, and then I did an interview, and and I got the job, and it was only for a few months, but it kind of started a chain of things. But it took a long time. I mean, before that, I mean, I say a long time, I mean, it was 8 months or 9 months, but that felt like a long time. It feels like a long time when you're 23 or whatever. So I think there is a gap, and I think it's different now, because also that was, oh God, what year was it? Like 2004, 2005. So, it's 15 years ago, and the world is like things are very different for people who are starting out in their career now. Like, the opportunities I had don't exist for people now, in the same way. I think that, there was a lot more money floating around. There were a lot more theatre companies. There were a lot more jobs. There were, all those things that don't necessarily exist. And it's interesting now when you look at when you're hiring people, like that there's a particular gap that exists around certain skills that normally would have developed for, like, let's say administrators or general managers, that would have developed by people having roles as company managers or general managers, learning. And there's now a gap that people don't have that same skill base. They develop it eventually, but they don't have the same. And I think I think it's interesting that that's one of the results of the recession, is that the level of skills needed in order to effectively manage an arts organization, institution, don't exist within I'm not going to say younger, because they're not necessarily young people, but in a particular gap in time between 2007 or 8 and 2012, that those, so I think that's a longer term impact thing. There are people who've been studying and qualifying, but then when they come out of their degrees and courses, the opportunities that were there for me don't, or people who would have graduated at a similar time, don't exist in the same way. And so a very small number of people get those experiences as opposed to a broader one. And then that causes separate issues then around access and who those people are, the type of people that are coming through, the type of, so that's another issue that the sector has to deal with around, because if the people coming through only have had a certain level of education, then they also have had to be able to access that certain, and if it's postgraduate education, all those things. So there's whatever those barriers are for people, they become even more heightened if you don't have access to that level of education potentially. You have a placement, you do a work placement. I mean, it's short enough, but it's still 7 or 8 weeks where you are immersed in an organization in some way, shape or form, and learning about that. I think that's really, that's really good. We've had some amazing people come through those places. We always try to have somebody a project, and I suppose, and I think one of the other benefits that course has now, certainly more than when I did it, is that it's really connected to the sector because of the people who teach on it. There are people who are working on a day-to-day basis in arts organizations or with artists. And I think that's a really good thing, that you get a real sense of what is happening in the world because the experience that people are telling you about is real as opposed to something they read about in a book. And I think that's where, from the point of view of from a practical point of view, I think that's really important. I think people who are actively working in a sector being part of some kind of element of the learning. I think a rooting and grounding in theory is really important, but the practice, it's like being a surgeon. You have to learn how to. You can understand the theory behind how the body works, but until you actually cut it open and look at it, you don't really understand it. So I think I think it's a similar thing with, if let's say arts management, because that's what we're talking about. But I think having somebody there who's going, yeah, well, this one time when I was producing this show and the set went on fire and this happened and this was the result of it. That's an experience that you can go, oh, okay, I can connect with that because that's a real thing that happened and that was what caused it and here are the outcomes. And I think that's something that's really important for higher education. And you see the difference now, when I've gone to, let's say, to the UCD course, I've gone a couple of times to talk to the students. And then I've gone to another one of the courses to talk to the students, and the ones in UCD are much more, they're engaged more with what's happening. And then on one of the other ones, you're like, you actually have no idea what I was reading in this book, so that's, I think the real world, I think if you're interested in going into the academic world and being a researcher and, and engaging with academia, then that's great. That makes total sense. But actually, if you are interested in, it's a practical practice-based course, the real world's important. Artists making art happen, supporting artists to make work. That's my motivation. That's what keeps me interested. And bringing that work to an audience. But sometimes what that means depends on the artist. But that for me is the real, the really interesting thing. I think that, I think artists are kind of extraordinary people. The way that, some of them are not necessarily good artists. I don't like their work, but some of them are amazing, and how they can communicate ideas or share ideas with people is amazing. And so that's what keeps me going. That's my motivation. I guess I'm lucky because I have a salary and I work for an institution that's 54 years old. So, I think it is difficult to constantly have to defend the value of the arts all the time. I think that is something, I'm on the steering committee of the National Campaign for the Arts. And so obviously at the moment in the COVID times, we're very active and, very much trying to, figure out, we just yesterday published our plan, the 13-point plan for the survival of the arts. And I think that that's important. I think that advocacy is really important, but I think constantly having to defend the value of something is very difficult. And I think that, and I think that must be even more difficult for artists because they're not in the same secure position that I am. So, and that constantly having to apply for funding all the time. And that's the reality of it as well. So I'm not saying that people should just be given money to do whatever they want. There has to be, it's public money, there has to be a process, but certainly, some way of making that less traumatic, I think would be good. when you run a building, the building becomes a big focus. And interestingly now, like, the building also is a pain, right? You know, it's because it's always broken or something, you know, there's someone's done something awful somewhere in the building and you have to figure out why that happened or whatever. I think, but interestingly, over the last few weeks has also reminded me what a luxury having that building is and having that space. And, you know, and in Project we have 3 different spaces where, I mean, the art happens all over the building, but, you know, there's 3 sort of art spaces, with 2 of which are black box rooms and one of which is a gallery space. And that is the focus really of a lot of the energy. We have done projects outside that and some stuff online. But actually, interestingly, during the COVID-19 crisis, we haven't done a huge amount of online work. We have done a project and we'll do a couple more later, but I'm kind of allergic to things happening online that aren't supposed to happen online. You know, I think you know, if it works for people, that's great, but I don't think, for example, streaming a play that was recorded in a theatre online with 1 camera is doing any justice to the art form and giving it away for free. You know, so I think that they're problematic issues for the sector to deal with, because people should be paid for their work and their work needs to be valued. So I think, yeah, so the spaces are broad, but also, you know, where does the audience find the work? And, you know, our audience mostly find us online. They come, you know, whether they book their tickets online or they find out about the shows through social media or whatever. So, or they find out what's showing in the gallery and they come in. So I think that you have to be nimble enough to move across various different spaces in order to be able to keep people informed about what you're doing. But the building's the thing. I suppose a big part of it, as I talked about earlier, is network. I think that, you know, relying on colleagues, being able to pick up the phone to people and ask advice, I think that's really important. There's no point in me saying, like, I have a really great yoga practice that really helps me focus my mind, because I don't, or something like that. You know, I work really hard, and I have a good network of people. I like talking a lot, so I'm on the phone all the time, and that's really fun. And I think that's, you know, that's good. And I think the other thing, I suppose, that sustains you is the work. Like when something really good happens, and I don't mean the kind of day-to-day things, but when you do something that's really, you know, fantastic and fabulous, it gives you the energy again for the dross of the work, you know, the kind of day-to-day admin stuff or whatever that you have to do alongside the fun art bit. And I think that's important, because it reminds you why you're doing it. I mean, it's very easy, right, to say, don't do it. Don't go into the arts. It's awful. But actually, I think I always think you should take opportunities as they arise. I think you should, you know, the 2 things I always do is ask someone you trust if they think it's a good idea. But I do think, you know, as opportunities come up, to take them. You know, that idea of, you know, if you have some kind of a network where you can develop some kind of, you know, group of people who think like you, and you know, I don't mean think like you, that's bad, but people who, I suppose, they feel like your people, let's put it like that, you know, I think taking those opportunities that arise. So, you know, even you see with, you know, like with collectives that come out of, you know, they often come out of colleges, but, you know, groups of, or they come out of youth theatres, things like that, or they come out of art college. And I think those, you know, those are useful things at the start of your career, because they help you make mistakes and they help you figure out what you want to do. So I think those things are good. You know, there isn't a career track for people. Like there isn't you're not going to come out of you know, and I think that's going to change anyway, right? Like the world is different now. People don't have, you know, a job forever, but certainly I think, you know, that sense of traditionally what could be like as I said earlier on, a kind of progressive career, that doesn't exist anymore. So I think you need to be able to be flexible and, you know, and change your ideas about what you want. And I think being too fixed in what you want is also dangerous, because then you'll never get what you want. Or, well, maybe you will if you're, I don't know, straight white man. But like, if you're, you know, but I think if you're there are those things that isn't a possibility anymore, I think. So, I think there's a certain amount of not low expectations, but managed expectations. Is that a bit depressing? Maybe that's a bit depressing.
This has been the Zoom Room Sessions, and this has been Cian O'Brien from the Project Art Centre. Cian, thank you so much for joining us today.
A total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No worries. And if people want to find out more about Project Art Centre, what is your website? What is the handles?
They can go to projectartcentre.ie, at Project Arts on Twitter, or at Project Art Centre on Instagram.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us today.